What happens when science fiction stops being fantasy and starts feeling terrifyingly real? For decades, filmmakers turned nuclear fears into stories that rattled audiences worldwide. Some films shocked governments, others left viewers in stunned silence, and hidden among the classics are lesser-known titles that push the fear even further. These aren't just movies, they're warnings dressed as entertainment, ready to uncover the ones that slipped under the radar, yet still cut deep. Let's begin. Threads, 1984. Sometimes a movie doesn't just scare you, it scars you. That's the reputation of Threads, the BBC drama that critics still call one of the most harrowing depictions of nuclear collapse ever filmed. Forget glossy Hollywood spectacle. This was bleak British realism at its most unforgiving. The story begins in Sheffield, an ordinary city filled with working-class families. You meet Ruth and Jimmy, two young people planning a wedding, dreaming of their future. But beneath that everyday calm, political tensions simmer in the background. And then it happens. The unthinkable. The world tips into conflict and the bombs fall. What follows isn't action sequences or heroic rescues, it's the slow-motion death of an entire society. The streets vanish under rubble, families scatter, survivors claw for scraps of food, while disease and radiation spread like wildfire. One of the most chilling choices by director Mick Jackson was to show everything through a documentary-style lens. Narration coldly explains the fallout, while the camera lingers on terrified children and collapsing neighborhoods. There's no hope, no escape, just the unraveling of civilization, layer by layer. When it aired, the response was staggering. Viewers across Britain described sitting in stunned silence long after the credits rolled. Schools debated whether it was too traumatizing to show teenagers. Even government officials reportedly worried about its impact on public morale. Critics praised its unflinching honesty, but audiences were shaken in ways few films have ever managed. What makes Threads so unforgettable is its refusal to let you look away. It's not about a single dramatic moment, it's about the grinding horror of what comes after. And for many, the scariest part wasn't the disaster itself, but how ordinary people just like us, could be reduced to dust in the blink of an eye. Fail Safe, 1964. Now, imagine the end of the world, triggered not by villains or monsters, but by a simple mistake. That's the terror at the heart of Fail Safe, Sidney Lumet's razor-sharp Cold War thriller that plays out like a ticking clock. The setup is chillingly simple. A technical error sends a squadron of American bombers hurtling toward Moscow. Commanders scramble to recall them, politicians argue over strategy, and phones ring furiously between Washington and the Kremlin. But every minute that passes pushes the world closer to destruction. There are no explosions on screen, no special effects, just men in stark rooms sweating as they weigh impossible choices. Henry Fonda anchors the film as a president forced into a decision no leader would ever want to face. Around him, a cast of brilliant character actors embody the chain of command, each one trapped by the very system meant to keep them safe. The dialogue is sharp, relentless, and filled with dread. What if the safeguards we trust most are the very things that could end us? Critics hailed Fail Safe as a masterpiece of tension. Many compared it to Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, which came out the same year. But where Kubrick twisted the subject into dark comedy, Lumet stripped away every ounce of humor. This was a sober, serious look at how fragile global stability really was. Audiences at the time left theaters shaken. No mushroom clouds were needed. The fear came from watching powerful men realize that the system had outpaced their control. And the film's ending, unexpected, brutal, and unforgettable, cemented its place as one of the great nuclear dramas of all time. If Threads shows us the aftermath, Fail Safe shows us the terrifying moment when leaders realize they might not be able to stop the chain reaction. And that's a nightmare that feels as urgent now as it did in 1964, when the wind blows 1986. What if the end of the world arrived not with explosions, but with heartbreaking innocence? That's the power of When the Wind Blows, an animated film that proves cartoons aren't always for kids. Based on Raymond Briggs's graphic novel, the story follows Jim and Hilda Bloggs, an elderly couple living in rural England. They're sweet, gentle, and completely ordinary two people who have spent their lives trusting the government to tell them what to do. When the sirens blare and war breaks out, they follow the official pamphlets to the letter. They tape up the windows, They build a shelter out of doors and cushions. They make tea. But as fallout seeps in, the tragic reality sets in. Their faith in authority is useless against the invisible poison in the air. The film never shows mushroom clouds or military battles. Instead, it zeroes in on two people clinging to routine, their health slowly failing, as they recite patriotic phrases and wait for help that will never come. The animation is deceptively gentle, almost watercolor in style, which makes the creeping horror even more devastating. David Bowie contributed the haunting theme song, and Roger Waters of Pink Floyd created the score, both of which layer the story with aching melancholy. When it premiered, audiences were stunned. Critics called it one of the most powerful anti-nuclear statements ever made. It's not about cities crumbling. It's about how ordinary, good-hearted people can be left defenseless when the unthinkable happens. What makes When the Wind Blows unforgettable is its contrast, the softness of the visuals against the crushing inevitability of the story. Creates a nightmare you can't shake. It isn't spectacle. It's tragedy on a kitchen floor as two people we grow to love fade quietly away. And sometimes that kind of whisper is louder than any explosion. The War Game, 1966. Imagine tuning into the BBC in the 1960s, expecting an educational program, and instead being confronted with something so terrifying it was banned from broadcast for 20 years. That's The War Game. Peter Watkins' pseudo-documentary that remains one of the most shocking portrayals of nuclear catastrophe ever made. Shot in a gritty newsreel style, the film imagines a nuclear strike on Britain. But instead of actors and dramatic scenes, it unfolds like a government training film gone wrong. The narration is cold, clinical, and brutally matter-of-fact. Streets burn. Citizens collapse in agony. Doctors run out of supplies. Soldiers shoot looters in the name of order. Every frame feels like an unfiltered news bulletin from the end of civilization. Watkins used non-professional actors to heighten the realism, capturing faces that looked like they'd been plucked straight from everyday neighborhoods. The camera lingers on their pain, their confusion, their despair. No melodrama, just raw documentation of how quickly society could collapse. The British government found it so disturbing that they refused to let it air, claiming it would alarm the public. Instead, it was shown in limited screenings, often to academics or activists, and only reached television in 1985, 2 decades after it was made. Critics who saw it early described audiences sitting in stunned silence. The imagery was too real, too close, too unbearable. Unlike fictional dramas, The War Game blurred the line between art and reality. Was it cinema, or was it prophecy? What makes the film so chilling is its refusal to offer comfort. There's no narrative arc, no heroes, no redemption. Just stark images of chaos and a voice calmly telling you this is exactly what would happen. And that's why it remains one of the most important films in the history of nuclear cinema. A vision so powerful, governments tried to bury it. Ladybug, Ladybug, 1963. Sometimes fear doesn't need mushroom clouds, it just needs a school bell. Ladybug, Ladybug is a haunting, overlooked gem that captures nuclear dread through the eyes of children and teachers caught in the shadow of disaster. Directed by Frank Perry, the film is set in a small-town American school during the height of Cold War tensions. One afternoon, the alarm system malfunctions, or maybe it doesn't. The teachers are told this isn't a drill, that it might be the real thing. With no clear answers and no way to confirm the truth, they're ordered to send the children home. What follows is a quiet spiral into panic. One by one, children walk alone, across fields and back roads, carrying fear in their small faces. Parents aren't always home, doors are locked, and the sky seems to press heavier with each passing minute. The terror comes not from explosions, but from uncertainty. What if this really is the end? The film builds its horror through silence and restraint. The most chilling moments come not from what we see, but from what we imagine. The audience is left holding their breath, waiting for something that may never come. Critics at the time praised its eerie atmosphere, comparing it to Rod Serling's Twilight Zone for its ability to turn ordinary settings into nightmare fuel. But what makes Ladybug, Ladybug unforgettable is its ending. Without spoiling the final twist, let's just say it leaves viewers rattled, questioning how thin the line between normal life and catastrophe really is. This wasn't a spectacle-driven film. It was a quiet, unnerving reminder of what it felt like to live in an age where one false alarm could shatter everything. And sometimes that subtle dread is far scarier than the spectacle of 1,000 special effects shots. The World, the Flesh, and the Devil, 1959. What if the end of the world left only 3 people alive? The World, the Flesh, and the Devil took that eerie premise and turned it into one of the boldest survival dramas of the 1950s. The story begins with Ralph Burton, played by Harry Belafonte, a miner trapped underground for days. When he finally escapes, he emerges into a silent, empty New York City. Streets are deserted, radios hum with static. Slowly, the horrifying truth dawns. A radioactive cloud has swept across the planet, leaving Ralph among the last survivors. At first, the film plays like a haunting one-man show. Belafonte walks through skyscrapers, drives empty cars, and scavenges supplies in eerie silence. But then he discovers he isn't entirely alone. A woman named Sarah, played by Inger Stevens, also survived. The two form a fragile bond, rebuilding some sense of humanity in a world that feels permanently broken. Just when hope begins to bloom, a third survivor arrives, a soldier played by Mel Ferrer, and with him comes jealousy, tension, and the threat of violence. The brilliance of the film lies in its allegory. Beneath the survival tale is a bold exploration of race and gender. In 1959, a major studio released a movie where an interracial romance simmers at the end of civilization. Hollywood rarely touched such themes, openly making this story as socially daring as it was apocalyptic. Critics were divided at the time. Some praised its ambition, others called it too talky. But over the years, it's been reevaluated as a fascinating hybrid, part survival thriller, part social commentary. The haunting image of Belafonte wandering through an empty Manhattan remains one of the most iconic depictions of loneliness ever put on film. In the end, The World, the Flesh, and the Devil reminds us that even if humanity survives the unthinkable, our deepest conflicts might follow us into the ruins. The Last War, 1961. Japan knew the reality of atomic destruction firsthand, and that made The Last War one of the most haunting global disaster films ever made. Released in 1961, this epic drama mixed family tragedy with an unflinching look at worldwide collapse. The story centers on the Yamashita family, an ordinary household in Tokyo. At first, life seems calm. The parents worry about bills, the children play in the yard. But international tensions escalate rapidly, and suddenly the entire family finds themselves staring into the abyss. Unlike many American films of the era, which frame nuclear danger as an abstract threat, The Last War makes it deeply personal. We don't watch faceless crowds. We watch a family we've come to care about as their world crumbles. Director Shu Matsubayashi spared no effort in portraying devastation. Miniature effects show Tokyo erupting into chaos, bridges, collapsing buildings, turning to ash. While some effects feel dated today, the emotion behind them is timeless. Audiences at the time were shaken by the raw imagery and the sobering reminder that Japan lived under the shadow of catastrophe more than most nations. The film's most striking quality is its sincerity. It isn't satire, it isn't pulp, it isn't spectacle for its own sake. It's a desperate plea for peace disguised as entertainment. And when the final moments arrive, they hit harder than any explosion, because you realize this isn't just fiction. For Japan, it was a warning echoing from lived experience. Critics outside Japan sometimes dismissed it as melodrama, but in its home country, it left audiences deeply moved. Today, it stands as one of the most emotionally raw depictions of global destruction, proof that sometimes the most powerful special effect is empathy. The Sacrifice, 1986. What if the end of the world wasn't shown as chaos, but as quiet despair? That's the path Andrei Tarkovsky chose in The Sacrifice, his final masterpiece released in 1986. The film opens on Alexander, a middle-aged intellectual, living with his family in a remote house by the sea. It's his birthday. Friends gather, wine is poured, life feels serene. But then the radio announces what everyone has dreaded. A nuclear confrontation is unfolding, and the world may be hours from destruction. Unlike most apocalyptic films, The Sacrifice doesn't cut to cities in flames or governments in panic. Instead, it stays fixed on one man's crisis of meaning. Alexander wanders his home and garden tormented by dread, searching for answers in philosophy, art, and memory. His fear is not just of destruction, but of what it all means, whether humanity deserves survival at all. Tarkovsky films every scene with hypnotic slowness. Long takes linger on windswept trees, trembling candles, and silent faces. The atmosphere is suffocating not because of explosions, but because of inevitability. Viewers feel the weight of approaching doom without ever seeing it directly. Critics hailed the film as a towering work of art, though some admitted it was difficult, even punishing to watch. For many, it wasn't about nuclear disaster, so much as it was about faith in humanity, or the lack of it. By the end, Alexander takes a drastic step to bargain for salvation, leaving audiences debating whether it was madness, courage, or both. The sacrifice is not entertainment in the conventional sense. It's a meditation, a slow descent into dread, and a reminder that sometimes the scariest apocalypse is the one that happens quietly inside our minds. Crimson Tide, 1995. Sometimes the scariest standoff doesn't happen in capitals or battlefields, but inside a single steel tube beneath the ocean. Crimson Tide, released in 1995, takes viewers into the claustrophobic world of a nuclear submarine, where one disputed order could mean the end of millions. The film drops us into the USS Alabama, commanded by Captain Ramsey, played with ferocious intensity by Gene Hackman. His executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Hunter, portrayed by Denzel Washington, represents the other side of the coin, calm, reasoned, and unwilling to gamble with irreversible consequences. When conflicting messages arrive, one ordering a strike, the other possibly canceling it, the entire crew becomes trapped in a deadly limbo. Do they launch? Or do they wait for confirmation that may never come? The tension builds not with explosions, but with heated words echoing through narrow corridors. Officers argue in hushed tones. Crew members glance nervously at sealed hatches. Every minute stretches like a lifetime as two brilliant leaders clash over the fate of the world. What makes Crimson Tide so gripping is how real it feels. The submarine's interior is a pressure cooker. Sweat drips, voices crack, and loyalties fracture as men realize the stakes of their decisions. Director Tony Scott amps up the suspense with tight shots, booming alarms, and a score that pounds like a heartbeat. Audiences loved it. Critics praised the performances, especially the verbal sparring between Hackman and Washington, which turned simple dialogue into duels of willpower. It wasn't just a thriller, it was a philosophical debate about duty-trust, and the razor-thin line between caution and catastrophe. In the end, Crimson Tide reminds us that sometimes the scariest enemy isn't outside the ship. It's the split-second decision between two men who both believe they're right. Threads of Silence, 1985. While Britain's Threads became infamous for its raw portrayal of destruction, lesser-known European television productions also took daring swings at the subject. One such rarity is Threads of Silence, a French and West German collaboration from 1985 that combined grim realism with haunting atmosphere. Set in a nameless European town, the film opens with families preparing for an ordinary day, children walking to school, shopkeepers opening shutters. Then, a radio announcement cuts through the routine. Global tensions have escalated. By evening, the skyline flashes with distant fire, and the nightmare begins. Unlike many disaster films, Threads of Silence focuses entirely on the days and weeks after the event. The story follows several households as they attempt to survive in basement cellars and makeshift shelters. Food dwindles, tempers flare. The silence outside, punctuated only by the wind and distant sirens, becomes its own form of terror. The film's visual style was stark. Grainy handheld cameras roamed through debris-filled streets, creating the sense that you were watching a documentary rather than fiction. Performances from unknown actors added to the realism. Viewers in France and Germany reportedly tuned in, thinking it was just another TV drama, only to find themselves shaken by the relentless bleakness. Although it never reached the international fame of The Day After, or Threads of Silence built a reputation in European archives as one of the most haunting made-for-television portrayals of nuclear fallout. Its rarity today has only amplified its mystique, with cinephiles trading bootlegs and describing it as the film you can't unsee. The title says it all. What lingers isn't fire or smoke. It's the silence of empty streets, broken families, and a future that never arrives. Dark of the Sun, 1968. At first glance, Dark of the Sun doesn't seem like it belongs in a list about nuclear dread. It's an action-adventure set in the Congo during a brutal civil conflict, but buried in its sweaty, chaotic story is one of the Cold War's most terrifying obsessions: the fate of fissile material. Rod Taylor stars as Captain Curry, a mercenary hired to lead a ragtag band of soldiers on a dangerous mission. Their goal isn't glory or conquest, it's to secure a stash of industrial materials that, in the wrong hands, could tilt the balance of global power. Alongside him is Jim Brown, whose presence brings both charisma and gravitas. Together they drive through jungles and villages in a train that feels more like a rolling coffin. The film doesn't shy away from brutality. Towns burn, civilians flee. The mercenaries struggle with loyalty, greed, and morality as the mission grows darker by the mile. While the word nuclear is never shouted from rooftops, the implication is clear. The stakes aren't just local, they're global. If this material is lost, the consequences could ripple far beyond Africa. Critics at the time were divided. Some dismissed it as exploitation. Others praised its unflinching look at the chaos of post-colonial conflict. Over time, however, Dark of the Sun gained cult status in part because of how eerily it reflected real Cold War anxieties. What lingers isn't just the action, it's the idea that, even far from the centers of power, ordinary missions could carry the weight of apocalypse. In that sense, Dark of the Sun isn't just a war thriller. It's a reminder that the shadow of global collapse doesn't always announce itself. It sometimes rides quietly on a train through the jungle. Testament, 1983. Sometimes the scariest story doesn't show explosions at all, it shows what happens after. Testament, released in 1983, is one of the most heartbreaking nuclear dramas ever made. The film follows a suburban California family led by Jane Alexander in a performance so raw it earned her an Academy Award nomination. Unlike other apocalyptic films, Testament doesn't cut away to political leaders or battlefields. It stays inside the home where a mother tries to keep her children safe and hopeful, while the outside world slowly fades into silence. There are no mushroom clouds, no fiery spectacles, just the slow, suffocating weight of fallout creeping into daily life. Neighbors vanish, supplies run out, children fall ill. And yet, in the face of despair, the family clings to small rituals. A birthday party with homemade cake, evenings of reading poetry aloud. Simple moments that feel more powerful than any special effect. Critics were stunned by the film's restraint. Roger Ebert called it one of the most powerful experiences he'd ever had in a theater, admitting it brought him to tears. Paramount originally made it for television, but its emotional impact was so overwhelming it was given a theatrical release. Audiences left shaken not because of spectacle, but because it felt so frighteningly possible. What makes Testament unforgettable is its intimacy. It doesn't scream, it whispers. And sometimes, whispers echo the loudest, reminding us that the true horror of collapse isn't the blast. It's the slow unraveling of love, dignity, and hope in the days that follow. So, what do all these films tell us? That the fear of sudden collapse wasn't confined to one country, one generation, or even one style of filmmaking. From bleak realism to surreal allegory, each story pulled back the curtain on how fragile our world really feels. Which of these unnerved you the most? Drop your thoughts below, hit that subscribe button, and share this Ask list with someone who loves hidden cinema. After all, the scariest stories are the ones that make us wonder, what if tomorrow is the day everything changes?